Thank you, Claire, and welcome to the Franz van Kat debate. America is still reeling from those horrific images of 20 children aged 6 and 7 being gunned down in the classroom. It's still not clear what drove 20-year-old Adam Lanza to kill his mother, those children and 5 other women at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. But the image of those young children being slaughtered has raised the possibility of becoming a game changer for those people advocating tighter gun control. Mass shootings in the US have become so commonplace that many schools now practice drills on what to do if a gunman is spotted on campus. And we're just seeing live images there of people arriving at the funerals of 2 of the young children, which is taking place in Newtown. But is President Obama ready to take on a Republican-controlled Congress and the courts?
In the coming weeks, I'll use whatever power this office holds to engage my fellow citizens, from law enforcement to mental health professionals to parents and educators, in an effort aimed at preventing more tragedies like this. Because what choice do we have? We can't accept events like this as routine.
And where do Americans stand, given the outpouring of grief in the last few days? Is this an issue that galvanises the country or is causing further polarisation? Joining me is Curtis Young, a representative of the Black Caucus for the Democrats abroad here in Paris, Brian Schiff, an Associate Professor of Psychology at the American University of Paris, and Azin, a specialist in American law. We're hoping to later talk to, from Alexandria and Virginia, Larry Pratt, the Executive Director of the Gun Owners of America. But first, let's head to Washington, D.C., where I'm joined by Franz van Kat's Philip Crowther. Philip, thank you very much for being with us. In the wake of that very moving speech by President Obama yesterday, what is the President expected to do next, Philip?
Well, he certainly hasn't put anything concrete on the table yet. That is still to come. Really, what we've seen over the last few days, first of all, an emotional response, of course, of Barack Obama, the parent who cried in public. The comforter-in-chief we also saw over in Newtown in the state of Connecticut, where, of course, the awful tragedy happened. But now we're seeing the president ready to start a conversation. And really, that is one of the big roles of an American president. He can decide at what time, when the time is right, to start talking about a certain, maybe complicated conversation. That was the case with his personal endorsement for gay marriage, for example. That can be the case again here. He certainly laid the groundwork for a conversation to start, but it will be, at the very least, a difficult conversation because it does include, as you say, the courts. It includes Congress as well, and a lot of convincing left to be done. But this is now a discussion that appears to be in the public sphere here in the United States. Discussions ongoing at any street corner, on the main television networks as well. And now we'll have to see what the next step might be from the US president. No concrete proposals from him so far. But when he does say he will do everything that his powers give him, well, that can be a lot in the case of a US president. Of course, he can propose a change or a conversation, but the law has to follow. And that's where Congress comes in. And that's where it gets very difficult indeed.
Philip, it's more than 3 days since that horrific shooting. Do you get the sense, however, that across the country, public mood is changing about this issue?
I've been speaking to a lot of members of the anti-gun lobby, those who want much stricter gun laws. In fact, I only just got back from a protest march by one progressive group here in Washington, D.C., marching towards the lobbying headquarters of the NRA, the National Rifle Association. They are, of course, key in this conversation, a conversation that on their behalf certainly has not happened yet, has not begun. The silence from the NRA has been absolutely deafening. Nothing whatsoever from them, no comment even on the shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. And also from Republican lawmakers, we're hearing very, very little indeed. Remember, very often they do go hand in hand, though it must be said that a lot of Democrats would also want the gun laws to stay in place the way they are. But from those who want stricter gun laws, you really get the impression that now has to be the time to talk about stricter gun laws, with the president laying the groundwork. Now the lobbying begins. That is what we're seeing now, with the anti-gun lobby getting into their element and trying to keep the pressure on the president for him to come out and to speak about concrete things that can be done, what kind of bills he would like to see passed both in the Senate and, more difficultly, in the House of Representatives, controlled by Republicans. The other part of the story hasn't happened yet. As I say, the NRA hasn't spoken yet, and Republicans in Congress have been very, very silent indeed. Once they join the conversation, that's when it will get more interesting and very, very complicated indeed.
Philip Crowther speaking to us there from Washington, D.C. Thank you. And first of all, let me just talk to you, Anders. Does President Obama really have the capability to take on the Congress, given that it's Republican-controlled, not to mention the courts? I mean, he's shown that he can use the presidential pulpit for bullying on certain issues, such as, taxing the rich. But he's really steered away, hasn't he, during his first term of actually taking on the gun lobby?
Yeah, I think during the first term he realized that many of the things he was hoping to achieve, changing the Washington as usual was one of them, doing something about gun control, is much more difficult to achieve because of polarization, because of the way Congress works. And here he's confronted again to a Republican majority, and Republicans are very much in favor of no control at all. And what has been said is true. Many Democrats, because they are supported by political contributions by the National Rifle Association, are very reluctant to do anything about gun control. So it would be, I was reading a poll, when you poll public opinion, it's mostly 50% in favor against gun control. The only difference is when the regulation would be only about assault weapons and semi-automatic rifles, then it's almost 60% that would be in favor of some gun control. But that's very, very little. And what is worrying is that the members of Congress feel they have the support of the population, who are convinced that having a gun brings more security. I was appalled by some remarks by parents having their children in the school saying, well, we are ready to have security like at airport, and it's important that the people in the school have guns to defend our children. So there is total lack of realization that just those 300 million guns in circulation bring the danger.
Larry Pratt, who's in Alexandria, Virginia, I'd like to bring you in at this point. I just want to read out a quote from you. This tragedy underscores the urgency of getting rid of gun bans in school zones, which Anne was just referring to. The only thing accomplished by gun-free zones is to ensure that mass murderers can slay more before they are finally confronted by somebody with a gun. Are you seriously telling me that schools, cinemas, shopping malls would be a safer place if teachers and public officials had guns?
Well, that's actually the history of our country, that the mass murders that we have suffered have occurred precisely in zones that were described legally as gun-free zones. It's like a magnet to a mass murderer to go where he has little expectation that he's going to be met with effective resistance. The Oregon shooting, which occurred a couple of days before this horrible school shooting in Connecticut, actually might have been much worse, except there was somebody at the mall disobeying mall policy who had his own gun, and when he heard the sounds of the shooter, ran to the shooting. When the shooter saw him, after he'd killed a couple of people, he killed himself. That is the way it can happen if we have armed citizens who are able to defend themselves and others.
But so you're telling me, for instance, if that teacher in that classroom had been armed with a gun, that it would have been a safer place for those 20 children caught up in crossfire between an armed teacher and the shooter?
Actually, 2 classrooms, and yes, much more likelihood that the shooter would have been taken down very quickly by an adult who had a gun. We have concealed carry laws in the United States which make it possible for people to carry a concealed handgun just about any place they want to go, except they can't do it in schools. And so it's not terribly surprising that when a mass murderer decides that he wants to do something horrible like this, he goes to a school because that's where he's not going to expect any resistance.
Curtis Young, when you hear Larry Pratt speak, what do you think?
Well, I'm troubled by it for a couple of reasons. One is that there's more to an individual with a gun than just. This isn't a Western movie. There's a mentality. There's a connection between people who have guns, their point of view about guns, which is something that you can't just impose on everybody. There are people with guns who are frightened of guns. There are people with guns who are unsure how to use them. We had an example in New York, in fact, not long ago, where near the Empire State Building, a man had murdered someone, was walking down the street. Two policemen confronted him. He pulled his gun. The policemen pulled their guns, and they shot bystanders. And these are professionals. These are trained professionals. So I suppose that the point that I'm trying to make here is that simply giving an individual a gun is no insurance to safety. In fact, I think that it opens the door for chaos.
Brian Schiff?
It just seems.
Well, so your solution then is to have people just simply be defenseless. I would rather take the risk of somebody not shooting accurately in a stressful situation than simply sitting there waiting for a monster to shoot.
But Larry, doesn't it make the situation 1,000 times worse? Not to mention, as Curtis just
No,
pointed...
we've had attempted mass murders in our country that were precisely stopped short when somebody got a gun and was able to confront the shooter, stopping the crime. And our biggest mass murder was committed back in the 20s when a monster blew up a school and killed 37 people with a bomb.
If I may, I think one of the things that's troubling me also is language. This was a mentally disturbed young man. To begin to refer to him as a monster, as a mass murderer, puts him in a certain category that removes him outside of the daily normal life. He's a guy who's among us, not a particular species that we call mass murderers. They become that after the fact. So simply arming everybody is not the answer. I think that we need to also look at mental care issues in America.
Yeah, Brian Schiff, at this point I want to bring you in.
It just sounds like the proposition is that we just revert back to the wild, wild west, where everybody has a gun to defend themselves. And this way, this is going to bring us some more security. And it just seems to me like this is the case in point that argument is absolutely incorrect. The guns that Adam Lanza had access to in the house when he murdered his mother and murdered about 26 other people were there for her own security. That's the reason why she had the guns there, stocked there. So I think it's a fallacy to say that if we have more guns, that we're going to have more security. Here's the case in point where, in fact, the guns were there for her security and they were used for another purpose.
Well, in Mississippi and Virginia and Pennsylvania, we've had attempted mass murders, and in some cases were committing mass murder when they were stopped short because one of the victims was able to get a gun and stop it. So it's not a matter of imagination. This is what has actually happened in our country, where people were able to exercise their right to keep and bear arms and were able to get firearms at the moment of need. Waiting for the police to come is not a solution. They come with body bags. We need to be able to defend ourselves. As you say, we don't know who's likely to go off. That's precisely the reason we need to be able to carry our weapons with us.
That's the reason why the guns should not be so easily available. Because we don't have statistics of how many times people are saved because somebody has a gun and how many more times people are killed. Okay, what are the statistics?
We do.
Okay.
It's over, according to the federal government, it's over 4,000 times a day Americans use a firearm to defend themselves against a criminal attack. And criminal attacks use firearms some 600-700 times a day. So clearly the utility of being an armed citizen far outweighs the abuse of firearms by criminals.
But Larry, let me ask you this. We, the United States, among industrial countries, Britain, Australia, France, Germany, Japan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have a murder rate among each other that far, 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 far exceeds that of any other industrial country. And in other industrial countries aren't walking around with guns. So
Two
I
things.
fail to see the logic that having more guns is going to make us safer when we can point to evidence where people who don't have guns
And
have
Larry,
safe
can I
communities.
just follow?
You overlook what happened in the last century when Hitler and Lenin and Stalin overran Europe and committed mass murder wholesale. Nobody was able to resist them. Guns were registered and collected by the governments and by the assailant governments as well. And in our own country,
I think we're
what you're
walking in
forgetting
very
is
dangerous
that our
ground here.
crime rates
Yes.
are driven by the center city areas where they have the most strict gun controls, where people are least able to protect themselves. Where I am, right outside Washington, D.C., in an urban county of over 1 million people, our murder rate is 0.3 per 100,000, far, far less than you have anywhere in Europe. And yet we have concealed carry firearms, people walking around with guns all over Fairfax County.
Larry,
with a
what you
murder
just
rate.
said defies actual statistics. What
I'm
you
giving
just
you
said
the
defies the
statistics.
actual
What I'm
number
saying defies,
of people who were
what I'm
murdered.
saying
And who were
defies
killed with
your
their own
understanding.
weapons.
But
Larry
the
Pratt,
statistics actually are
Larry
against
Pratt-
what you're saying. You're making them up, my friend.
Larry Pratt, let me just say at this point that the reality is US crime rate has actually gone down, but the number of mass shootings has increased dramatically. Also,
No, it hasn't. It's actually been rather consistent over the last decades.
But let me point out the experience in my country. In 1996 in Australia, we saw a horrendous mass shooting at Port Arthur. As a result, the federal government, in coordination with all the state governments, very quickly moved to tighten gun laws, and firearm deaths dropped by 60% in the 10 years subsequent to 1996. Surely you must understand there is a need for greater control of guns.
We have a government that has just been caught red-handed supplying guns to the Mexican cartel. We're to trust our government. You should trust governments in other countries that have been willing to commit genocide against their people, and you tell us to trust our government? I
But
don't
again,
think
you're
so.
taking a specific example and you put it out of context. You know that it was a total FBI operation and the aim was to destroy some of the gun cartels, not to give the
No,
weapons
the
away.
aim was to jack up a phobia about guns to create a political environment more supportive of gun control. And the whistleblowers have made that extremely abundantly clear. This was not something that went awry. This was something where they just flat out got caught doing some very evil things. Governments can do that. And your recent experience in Europe, of all places, should educate you to the fact that you don't want to place all your eggs in the government basket.
those-
Larry Pratt, and I'm sorry at this point, I'm just going to say we're going to have to take a break because we're going to have to run a few commercials, but we'll be back very shortly. Do stay with us here on France 24.